Welcome back to our continuing coverage on the preliminary report, the 15-page report of the Aircraft Accident Investigation Board that has now been submitted to the Ministry of Civil Aviation. It's up on their website, and it gives us some preliminary clues, some answers as to why Air India Flight 171 from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick crashed. And it is going in the direction of the fuel control switch. Those two switches that you see, they're called the fuel control switch. They are the ones that allow the movement of the fuel from the fuel chamber, from the fuel tank, out into the carburetor, and from the carburetor into the engines. The engines require the fuel to be fired up and to give the aircraft lift and thrust and power. That fuel control switch was moved from run to cutoff, and then back again from cutoff to run after the pilots realized that the fuel had been cut off from entering the engines. So the 787 fuel control switches, like I said, there are only two modes there, and it has to be manually done. There's a run mode if the switches are in the up position, and there is a cutoff mode if the switches are in the down position. Now these switches are controlled only either at the start of the flight or after the flight has ended. Now it is not ever moved mid-flight. Something happened inside the cockpit of Air India Flight 171, which resulted in these fuel control switches being moved from the run mode to the cutoff mode, and as a result, immediately the flight lost thrust, it lost power. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. It cannot be done electronically, it cannot be done remotely, it cannot be done by somebody from outside the cockpit. It has happened inside the cockpit because there is a metal stop lock. Now, what you need to do is you have to manually pull both the levers. It has to cross over that metal lock switch and then be placed either down or up. There are also these two metal brackets. They're called the guarded brackets, which are on either side, because in case, one captain's hand or the other co-pilot's hand hits these levers, that they don't accidentally move either up or down. So it's an extremely well-designed mechanism, and clearly on board Air India Flight. Let me ask Mark Martin, who's the CEO of Martin Consulting and Aviation Expert. Mr. Martin, so from this 15-page report, what we do know is that the fuel control switches were in cutoff position. They should have been in run position. The pilots realize it, and they pull both back into the run position. One of the engines gets relit. The second one did not have enough time to get relit. And of course, the rat had already been deployed, and the plane crashes. But the question is, does this necessarily have to be done manually? Why did they do that? Why was it in cutoff in the first place? How come no one noticed it? Or were they moving it from run to cutoff and from cutoff back to run because it was a dual engine failure? And as Air Marshal said a moment ago, that is the aircrew manual for when there is a double engine failure.
Let's understand the facts behind this. Okay, first up, you're at 180 knots, you're 800 feet, you had your takeoff thrust, you lost both engines. Now, when you lose both engines, then that's far more significant than cutting off your fuel. Your fuel cutoff valve, the switch which is there, you got to pick it up, put it over the bridge, and then put it down. Okay. Now, there's no chance in hell that the fuel cutoff switch is going to automatically trigger unless there was severe vibration on the aircraft that triggered something to push it back. Now, let me be very, very clear over here. This is a digital aircraft. The whole aircraft is computer controlled. It's software controlled. It's got something called LSAP, loadable software as a part. Every part of what you see in that aircraft in the 787 is controlled by a software system and a server. Now, the first question of mystery I have here is that, first of all, no pilot would be stupid or dumb enough during takeoff, when his attention is focused forward on the flight instruments, he still is flying manual, he's hand flying it, he hasn't activated the auto throttle, autopilot is not engaged, he's climbing at 800 to 1000 feet, he's still flying manually. There's no chance in hell your hands are going to go back and fiddle around with the fuel cutoff. Something is wrong with the fuel cutoff. Now, if you read the same report, if you've seen the pages before and not gone to why the crash happened, in 2018, Boeing issued a service bulletin stating that there have been incidents where the fuel cutoff valve has gone back to cut off from run. This was the part number. This part number is constant in the 737 and the 787. It's the same part, guys. let me be clear.
Sorry, Mr.
Now,
Mark, I'm going to interrupt you. Just give me 1 second because we have to take a break. That's mentioned in this AIAB report as well. This 2018 advisory was a non-mandatory advisory from FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, to all airliners. It was a non-mandatory one. That's been cited in this report as well. We'll talk about that in just a moment on the other side of this quick break. Mark D. Martin is CEO of Martin Consulting. Mr. Martin, I'm sorry I had to cut you off in the last wheel, but you know, the sequence of events after takeoff, 0 seconds, the takeoff happens, the aircraft lifts off. 3 seconds after takeoff, which Arunima was also referring to at 8:08:42 is when it hits the maximum speed of 180 knots. 4 seconds after takeoff, engine 1's fuel switch is cut off. 5 seconds after takeoff, engine 2 fuel switch is cut off. 8 seconds after takeoff, the RAT is deployed because the RAT is a mechanism in the Boeing 787 which gets deployed when there's a dual engine failure. So within 10 seconds of takeoff, both pilots realize that there is a dual engine failure. 13 seconds after takeoff, they try to push it back from cutoff position to run position, the fuel control switches. This is for engine 1, and then 17 seconds after takeoff, they try to push the second engine, the second fuel control switch from cutoff to run. But because, as everybody has been saying, this flight hadn't got enough lift, hadn't got enough power, it just sort of papers off and then crashes outside the perimeter wall. What are the questions that stand out for you, Mr. Martin, after this preliminary report?
So Zaka, it's almost deja vu. I remember 15 years ago, you and I were talking about Air India Mangalore crash when you were over at Headlines Today. So I'm just going to fast forward. The RAT only gets deployed when you have a total failure and an emergency situation. It's an auto logic in the 787, on the 320, on all aircraft. Now, if the RAT is deployed, RAT never deploys if the switches have gone over to cutoff. Okay, switches going off or going over to cutoff does not mean RAT deploys. RAT deploys because it's an auto sensor that everything is failed on board. That's the first thing. So the word is engine failure, and if engine failure occurred, dual engine failure, then the RAT board. That's the first thing. So the word is engine failure, and if engine failure occurred, dual engine failure, then the RAT deploys. That's the first fact on this whole thing. The second is, assuming that the fuel cutoff switches had a problem, assuming many a times, Zaka, I'll tell you, OEMs issue a service bulletin, not an advisory circular or not an AD, because they just want to keep it subtle and just inform everybody, and they pass the responsibility back onto the airline and the operator. Now, if the fuel cutoff switches went back, and even if you turn it back and you turned it on, there's no chance you're going to get the kind of takeoff thrust in 3 seconds. You're at 800 feet, you're dropping like a rock, 180 knots, your speed is reducing, all your attention is in your forward cockpit instruments. There's absolutely no way your hand would ever go back. That's the second part I'm going to say. The third part is that even if you had an engine failure, and let's assume the procedure was to recycle the fuel switch, the fuel valve, that even in that it takes almost 3 to 4 minutes to start again. So the first point we need to understand, and we need to be very, very clear, is that this is an initial report.
Correct.
There's a lot more work that needs to be done. No stone should be left unturned, Zaka, and I'll tell you why. Because why on earth would a mechanical switch go from manual, run to cutoff? Now, I got to be clear, as an investigator, and I'm sure everybody on your panel, including Air Marshal, will say this, when a RAT gets deployed, there's extreme vibration on board the aircraft. I don't know if it's happened to me. A RAT gets deployed and there's vibration. Now, my logical understanding as an aviation guy and a pilot would suggest that vibration led the engine switches to go, because it's obviously a wear and tear mechanical device. Now, granted, there was an AD, there was an SP which came out in 2018 that warned everybody to inspect it. Maybe they did not inspect it. Maybe they should have changed it, replaced it. We don't know. But if a mechanical switch with a spring, you could actually got to pick it up and put it into place. It's a gate, and in that, if it went back, then clearly it could either be because of extreme vibration, or something which is triggered, or that mechanism has been overused, or the metal frame or the gate has been worn out. These are the 3 or 4 plausible reasons. But again, guys, Zaka, you and I have spoken about crashes, sadly, nearly 4 or 5 times in the last 15 years, right? And my request is let that full investigation get out, because now, let's not speculate. We can come up to our own theories, which is good. And I think, this is not a pilot issue, because why on earth would the pilot pull the switches back at 800 feet and kill himself and kill 260 people on board? Okay. Something has triggered that. And as you guys have rightly pointed out, that is the crucial bit, and we need to go back and ask why, and that's what will establish.
That's a fair point. Like I said, this whole exercise is not about finger pointing or blaming someone or blaming the pilot and the co-pilot. No, I mean, something went abysmally wrong on board Air India Flight 171. We have to find out what that was, and this preliminary report is just a 15-page report, and these final reports take probably years. I remember the 2020 air crash that happened in Kozhikode. It took a whole year for it.
I remember it took almost 4 years. Remember, Zaka? Exactly. We spoke about it in June 2010. It took 4 years to get out.
For it to come, yeah. Arunima wants to make a point on this.
Just one point. This point about vibration, that possibly some vibration happened. On that point alone, let's bring in what the sole survivor of the air crash has told investigators. The sequence of event, as he describes it, is that the flight takes off and suddenly he says it feels like it has gone in a limbo. It's not moving forward, it's not going back, and then the lights come off, and then suddenly the aircraft accelerates, and then it drops dead. The crash happens. So at no point is he mentioning any kind of vibration or any external factor that he could take note of, which could have led to this kind of a situation.
Also, I mean, so one basic question is, if there was, as you said, some vibration that led to automatically the switch going from run to cutoff, and the pilots, by the time they realized it was too late, wouldn't this report also say that we've asked GE, the engine manufacturer, we've asked Boeing, the manufacturer of the aircraft, to look into this possibility?
So the flight data recorder data is binary, Zaka. It just shows 0 or 1. Okay. 1 is on, 0 is off, or it might show 2, 3 as part of a setting. It's digital. And this DFDR is one of the most advanced in the world, because the 787 also has a cockpit camera. Okay, so a cockpit camera is installed on the 787, and that cockpit camera records all action. So it's a surprise to me as to why did the enhanced airborne flight recorder, why doesn't the report talk about the cockpit camera footage? Where is the cockpit camera footage? Because that will reveal everything. This aircraft has got a cockpit camera which focuses on the cockpit. It's got a galley camera. It's got a left camera which also captures pilot actions. It's an advanced flight data recorder. And my question is, we want to see that video footage of the cockpit camera, because that will tell us precisely what happened. Also, we have to be very clear that from time of takeoff, we were just talking about 20 seconds to crash.
Correct.
At 20 seconds to crash, these are micro steps and milestones which have occurred in this incident. RAT will only deploy when you've lost everything: hydraulics, pneumatics, engine, electrical power, all gone. That's your last resort. You're flying on something called an essential power bus, which, Zaka, is a battery that sits below your chair, your seat, and your hydraulic electrical power from the RAT. That's it. Everything has failed. You're down to the last straw. Now, in that situation, if somebody looked back and saw that the switches were, first up, ask me honestly, there's no chance in hell the switches can go back miraculously or by, divine intervention. Okay? And second of all, if it went back, then there's something wrong with the switches and that mechanical device. Maybe it's worn out and no maintenance guy from Air India chose to even bother to check it. And the third is that RAT deploying is the biggest evidence.
Well, I want to... Is that a satisfactory explanation? Because there has to be a dual engine failure for the RAT to be deployed, and the RAT was deployed in this. Both our previous pilots saying that the movement of the fuel control switch from cutoff to run, or run to cutoff and then back from cutoff to run, is a standard operating procedure whenever there is electrical failure or hydraulic failure or some kind of engine failure.
Yes, I agree. And I also agree with when Mark says there isn't any chance in hell at that altitude, at that time, for them to restart these engines. There was no way they could do that. There wasn't enough altitude, there wasn't enough time. Everything up to 625 feet was normal. That was a normal rotation, normal takeoff, everything was fine. But I submit that probably whatever happened is when those fuel cutoff switches were physically turned off. That's when you turn off the engine, causing the RAT to deploy. RAT, as you mentioned correctly, it brings limited amount of electricity and hydraulic power just to fly the airplane. It doesn't retract the gear or anything like that. It just doesn't have enough power. Therefore, my question is, why did those switches, and I don't agree with the gentleman that said those switches can turn off themselves. They cannot. It's impossible. Unless if it's an internal electronic malfunction, which is a possibility. I'm not saying it's impossible. But physically to turn off those two switches, someone has to do it manually. And perhaps they were following the procedure for restart the engine. But my only question is why, if that's such a low altitude where you have no chance, there was a possibility of having some power on those engines. But when you turn off those cutoff switches, you kill any possibility of turning those engines on. And at that altitude and that airspeed, there is no way to gain control of that aircraft.
You know, a lot of pilots have been taking exception to the fact that this could not have been manually done. The last thing the pilot or the co-pilot are doing within the first 30 seconds after takeoff is moving these fuel control switches. So what explains?
First of all, I want to say that we're still kind of speculating, and I hate to do that. We don't have all the facts. What we know now, it eliminates some of the crazy ideas initially that everybody was wrong, especially the YouTube aviation experts, all these young pilots that are now telling everybody that they know exactly what happened, like the flap situation or configuration problem. We know there was no fuel contamination. We know there was no bird strike. But we do know that those two switches were at some point manually, as you correctly mentioned, and I must commend you for your knowledge, because a lot of interviews I do with TV, they have no idea what they're talking about. At least you know what you're saying, and it's correct in most cases. Those two, we want to know why those two switches were lifted into the cutoff position, because as you correctly mentioned, the sequence of events, everything was fine up to 180 knots and 620. And we saw in the video, it was a normal takeoff. Only after those switches were turned off is when we lost power, obviously.